I didn't always want to be a nurse. I wanted to be a travel agent, a marine biologist, a farmer at one stage. I even went to agricultural college for 2 weeks until I realised that farming wasn't for me. And my mum recently reminded me that I made them buy rubber boots and a special coat because I was absolutely insistent that that was the career that I would have for the rest of my life. And as it turns out, I hated farming. But every week I flitted from one thing to another. And eventually I fell into volunteer work, and I was working with adults who had disabilities. And I watched some of the nurses who were caring for them. And the nurses said, "Why don't you do nursing? You'd be quite good at it." Well, I was quite shocked. I told my parents, and my dad laughed out loud, so he was quite shocked as well. But I thought, why not? I'll give it a go. In those days, we used to have a bursary, which enabled me to go and train to be a nurse. And I thought, this is something I could dedicate my life to. And then during the first week, and an occupational health blood test, I fainted when I saw my blood. And the phlebotomist who was with me said, "I think you really need to rethink your career." But I'm so, so glad that I stuck at it. I was a nurse for 20 years. I'm still a nurse. I'll always be a nurse. But it wasn't actually until I was on the other side of the fence that I really began to understand the job that I'd been doing for so long. It's like any job, you just do the job without thinking about it too much. And then 6 years ago, my dad died of lung cancer, and while he was dying, he was cared for by a nurse who was just being a nurse. And her just being a nurse and just doing the job made such an enormous difference to me, to my dad, to my whole family. She, in the smallest of actions, made the biggest difference to all of our lives. She did so many things. She was on call 24 hours a day for us. And me and my brother can be quite annoying, so no doubt we were texting her all the time. She came to my dad's funeral, and I remember thinking, but that's what I do. I go to funerals. My colleagues come to funerals with me. There's lots of nurses in this room that I've been to many funerals with. That's the job of a nurse. How amazing and how astonishing. There are nurses in this room that I've worked with over the years who've cared for patients who feature in the book. And I've changed all the names and details, but we've been in situations together looking after patients such as Jasmine. And I've been thinking a lot about Jasmine recently because of Grenfell Tower fire events and the horrific things that happened there. And Jasmine was an 11-year-old girl who we looked after in paediatric intensive care. And she was on a life support machine. She was very, very sick. She was on the edge of life. She was on a ventilator. And her brother was in a bed a few beds away from her. He was also very sick. He'd been in the same house fire. Their mum had tragically died in the fire. And Jasmine's aunt, her mother's sister, wanted to come in and spend precious hours with Jasmine. But we nurses, we were really reluctant to let her in because the ward smelled so strongly of smoke and fire that it was everywhere. The nurses were covering their noses and mouths, and somebody had even asked for a theatre mask. So we knew we couldn't make things any better for that poor family, but surely smelling smoke would just make that much worse. And so we washed Jasmine's hair. And I held her head as another nurse washed her hair, and after a few moments, nothing had really changed on the monitor. Jasmine's heart rate and blood pressure and arterial blood pressure had all stayed the same. But the nurse and I looked at one another. Something had shifted, something had really changed. Jasmine's head was a feather in my hands. We both knew, the nurse and I, that Jasmine had died in that moment. We took another moment, and then we carried on. And after a while, the bucket of water underneath Jasmine's head, which was full now with blackened water, I took to the sluice area and I tipped it out. And I can remember so clearly the smell of burning, and I can remember so clearly thinking about a brother and a sister trapped in a room in a fire and a mother desperately trying to get to them. And I wanted so much to cry, but I pushed the tears back in my head. And I made my stomach hard, and I went to find Jasmine's aunt, and I went back to Jasmine's bedside with her aunt. Because that's the job of a nurse. That's what a nurse does every single day. There are days like the day when I looked after, with some of the nurses in this room, patients like Betty. Betty was an elderly lady who was on a trolley in a corridor. She was frail, she was alone, and she had nothing medically wrong with her. She was terrified and cold, and all I did was give her a sandwich and make her a cup of tea, and I sat with her and I held her hand. And I listened to her stories about her husband Stan and how they danced and how her wedding dress was made out of parachute silk. And after a while, she perked up and she said that I had saved her life. And of course, I'd done nothing of the sort. I was just being a nurse. There are patients and there are nurses in this room who looked after patients with me, patients like Emmanuel. Emmanuel was a baby who was wrapped up in a sandwich bag because he was so small. He was too small and too early. And he'd had a bleed in his brain and he'd had cardiac arrests. And he was on the edge of life. And his mum, Joy, kept saying he might be a doctor. We've got a lot of doctors in our family. He might be a lawyer, because she was a lawyer. Maybe he'll be 6'3", because his dad's really tall. And she taught me so much about the importance of having hope, because she was a very intelligent woman, and she knew that her son might not survive. He certainly might not meet any of his milestones. He might not be able to walk or talk or cry. These are the kind of things that nurses do on a daily basis. And yet nursing is the most undervalued of all the professions. If how we treat our most vulnerable members is a measure of our society, then the act of nursing itself and how we treat our nurses is a measure of our humanity. And humanity is in trouble, I think. But nursing has never been more important than now. Nursing hasn't really changed much over time, and it is difficult to get into language. I agree with Janet. It predates history books, and it will continue long after we're here. Medicine has changed quite a lot, but nursing has been consistently about technical skills, but mainly about the art of caring. We're moving into an age where we're not suffering from necessarily curable diseases. We're not going to be relying on technology or drugs and those things that have helped us before, because we're suffering from loneliness, old age, isolation, social anxiety. These are the things that nursing can help. In fact, nursing is the only thing that can help these afflictions that we're suffering from. And so nursing has never, ever been more important than now. I wrote this book for nurses. There's a universal language of nursing that is really interesting to think about philosophically. A nurse from Canada or from Uganda or from the UK pretty much do the job in a similar way, and always have and always will. What a great comfort that is in a world that's changing so rapidly, I think, in the wrong direction. It's an enormous comfort. So when I had the idea of trying to put into words nursing, I approached my agent, Sophie, and said, I'd quite like to write some fiction about nursing because I'm used to writing fiction, and I'd quite like to write some non-fiction. And Sophie said, well, let's just have a little think about that. But it is really difficult to get into words what nursing is, and that was the thing I struggled with most of all. Because when I started nursing, I thought it was about technology and science and chemistry, biology, math. And by the time I'd finished nursing, I realised it's about politics and philosophy and all the arts, not just one art, all the arts. It's not one thing or another thing, it's absolutely everything. So I really hope that I found some kind of language that people can understand, not just nurses, but people outside nursing, because I really want people outside nursing to understand and appreciate the job that nurses do, day in, day out. And nurses are working harder than they ever have before. And still, they provide care, compassion, and kindness every single day for all of us. Nursing reminds us that even when we are most alone, we're not alone at all, actually. I've got some thank yous, and it's quite a long list, so apologies. And apologies if I forget anyone. Sophie Lambert, who I'm going to cry if I thank too much. She knows. All the team at CNW, especially Emma. Where's Emma? She's here somewhere. She's right back there. Emma should have been covering for Sophie when Sophie went on maternity leave, but Sophie was still emailing me during labour, so she... And we had meetings when your son was, what, a week old? We've always got lots of kids around when we have these big meetings, and it's kind of worked, which is great. Jake, Alexander, Alexandra, the whole entire team, I really appreciate all you've done. Juliet Brooke, where is she? Maybe she's right at the back. Juliet Brooke and Clara Farmer are the most amazing editors that a person could ever hope for. And if there are any really clever words in this book, it's down to them. Charlotte has basically the glue that's held us all together. I really appreciate it. Rachel and Richard and everyone at Vintage, I absolutely appreciate so much. The Chatto team, Chloe, Penny, Suzanne, everybody there. You might find this quite hard to believe, but I can be a bit tricky sometimes. And Fran and Sophie are my publicists, and they have kept me very calm at some quite difficult moments, like when I was nearly hospitalised yesterday. Anyway, I'm here. Luke, Speed, and Damien and Rebecca at Mammoth Screen are the nicest people in Hollywood. And thank you for being so humble and so awesome and lovely, even though you live in TV world, which is quite something. Lord Crisp is here. Thank you so much for having me as a champion for Nursing Now. I'm very, very excited to get involved with that, and I'm in some very, very good company. Amnesty International, Lucy and Nikki particularly, thank you. St Mary's, Jonathan and Russell are around here somewhere. The RCN and the RCN Foundation have just been amazing, and I'm so happy to support both organisations, and I'm sure that Vintage and Penguin Random House are very happy as well to support the RCN Foundation. It's a really worthy cause. I want to thank Guy and my mum and my brother. The thing about writing a memoir is I'm writing my memories, but they're also their memories, and they're quite painful and private memories sometimes. So thank you for letting me share those for the greater good. Thank you all for coming here from far and wide. I know there's people that have flown in from everywhere, and it's really amazing, and I really appreciate it, and I will come and hug every single one of you now that I've been hidden from you all. Hope you all talk to each other. You are the best humans in the world, and so you'll have a lot in common. There are going to be drinks at the Phoenix pub after the drinks here. So, and I believe there's some money behind the bar. So my nursing friends will make good use of that. I'm absolutely sure. And finally, I want to thank the nurses and the doctors that I've worked alongside over the years. It's been a complete privilege to work alongside you, and you are my heroes. This is for nurses. Thank you very much.